page 1-14. Work won't love you back. How devotion to our jobs keeps us exploited, exhausted, and alone, by Sarah Jaffe, 2021. A deeply reported examination of why doing what you love is a recipe for exploitation, creating a new tyranny of work in which we cheerily acquiesce to doing jobs that take over our lives. You're told that if you do what you love, you'll never work a day in your life. Whether it's working for exposure and experience, or enduring poor treatment in the name of being part of the family, all employees are pushed to make sacrifices for the privilege of being able to do what we love. In Work Won't Love You Back, Sarah Jaffe, a preeminent voice on labor, inequality, and social movements, examines this labor of love myth of the idea that certain work is not really work, and therefore should be done out of passion instead of pay. Told through the lives and experiences of workers in various industries, from the unpaid intern, to the overworked teacher, to the non-profit worker and even the professional athlete, Jaffe reveals how all of us have been tricked into buying into a new tyranny of work. As Jaffe argues, understanding the trap of the labor of love will empower us to work less and demand what our work is worth. And once freed from those binds, we can finally figure out what actually gives us joy, pleasure, and satisfaction. 0.0 Introduction. Welcome to the working week. I love my work. Technically, I don't have a job. I haven't had one in a few years, since I left the last magazine that hired me full-time for a one-year stint as a staff writer. Since then, I have supported myself as a freelance journalist, to varying degrees of success. I travel, I report, I give the occasional talk, and mostly, I write. I meet fascinating people and get to share their stories with the world, and I actually, at least at the moment, make a living at it. I also make about $15,000 less a year than the average woman my age with my level of education. I am the poster child for work in today's economy. I'm flexible, working on the fly from a laptop in coffee shops around the country and occasionally the world. I don't have an employer that pays for my health insurance, and forget about retirement benefits. Vacation? What's that? I have none of the things that used to signify a stable adult life. No family, no property, just me and a dog. On the upside, I don't have a boss, either. This book isn't about me, though. It is about the millions of people around the world who share some or even most of my working conditions, even if they've managed to snag a good old-fashioned full-time job. So many features of what people used to consider employment security are gone, melted into air. Instead, as 1,000 articles and nearly as many books have told us over and over, we're all exhausted, burned out, overworked, underpaid, and have no work-life balance, or just no life. At the same time, we've been told that work itself is supposed to bring us fulfillment, pleasure, meaning, even joy. We're supposed to work for the love of it, and how dare we ask questions about the way our work is making other people rich while we struggle to pay rent and barely see our friends. Like so many things about late capitalism, the admonishment of 1,000 inspirational social media posts to do what you love and you'll never work a day in your life has become folk wisdom, its truthiness presumably everlasting, as stretching back to our cave person ancestors, who I suppose really enjoyed all that mammoth hunting or whatever. Instead of never working, the reality is that we work longer hours than ever, and we're expected to be available even when technically off the clock. All this creates stress, anxiety, and loneliness. The labor of love, in short, is a con. But the expectation that we will love our jobs isn't actually all that old. Once upon a time, it was assumed, to put it bluntly, that work sucked, and that people would avoid it if at all humanly possible. From the feudal system until about 30 or 40 years ago, the ruling class tended to live off its wealth. The ancient Greeks had slaves and but also a lower class of workers, including manual laborers, skilled artisans, and tradespeople to do the work so that the upper classes could enjoy their leisure time and participate in community life. If you've ever read a Jane Austen novel and wondered how those people who don't seem to do much of anything, except hem and haw about whom to marry, got by, you get the general picture. Work, to the wealthy, was for someone else to do. Since the 1970s and 1980s, there has been a shift. The ownership class these days does tend to work, and indeed, to make a fetish of its long hours. But the real change has come in the lives of those of us who don't make millions. It's become especially important that we believe that the work itself is something to love. If we recalled why we work in the first place, it to pay the bills, we might wonder why we're working so much for so little. People have long considered the question of whether work should be enjoyable. In the 1800s, socialist and artisan William Morris wrote of the three hopes that might make work worth doing: a hope of rest, hope of product, hope of pleasure in the work itself. Morris acknowledged that the idea of pleasurable work might seem strange to most of his readers, but argued that the inequality that capitalism had wrought meant that some who did no work lived off the labor of others, who were condemned by this system to useless toil. Modern industry had taken away what little independent and power craftspeople might have had and reduced them to interchangeable, robotic wage laborers. No one cared whether the proletariat liked its work; it wasn't given a choice in the matter. But those proletarians, too, usually tried their hardest to escape work. The labor movement's earliest demands were usually for less work, shorter working hours, down to 12, then 11, then 10, then 8, plus days off. The strike, the workers' best weapon, is, after all, a refusal of work, and for a while they wielded it effectively, winning some concessions on the length of the working day and week as well as on wages. Capitalists would give up a little here and there to keep the profits flowing, but they also sought new strategies to keep workers on track beyond simple brute force. The carrot that was eventually offered to the industrial working class was what is often called the Fordist Compromise, named, of course, after Henry Ford's Ford Motor Company. Workers would give up a large chunk of their time, but a manageable only generally 5 8-hour days of work a week to the boss, and in return they would get a decent paycheck, health care, either provided by the company, in the United States, or, in other countries, provided by the state, and maybe some paid holidays and a pension to retire on. It was Morris's hope of rest and, if not actually the hope of controlling one's product, at least some financial remuneration that provided workers with some ability to support themselves, and maybe a family, and to enjoy themselves in their time off the shop floor. This might be hard for some of us to imagine, now, as we sneak in time to read between checking work emails or waiting on call for the next shift. And it's certainly not something to romanticize. The work was often both grinding and dull, and workers often too tired to enjoy their hard-won free time. But it allowed for a brief period of stability, from the end of the Great Depression until the 1960s, nostalgia for which still haunts us today. Like most compromises, the Fordist bargain had left both sides vaguely unsatisfied, and it was held steady largely by repeated strikes from the workers on one side and repeated attempts by the bosses to unpick it on the other. But it was a deal that the ownership class had more or less gone along the sharing too much. It was less appealing when crisis struck in the 1970s. By the 1970s, the dynamism the system had displayed in the immediate post-war decades was exhausted, worn down by multiple political challenges and institutional sclerosis, explained economist James Medway. The solution to this problem, for capital, was to squeeze labor harder. Companies closed factories in high-wage countries and moved them to places where they could pay a fraction of the rates workers commanded in the United States or the United Kingdom. Working hours began to creep upward, and incomes down. More families relied on two incomes, and with two working parents, no one had time to do the housework. By 2016, the United States had hemorrhaged enough industrial jobs that Donald Trump made them a focus of his pitch to make America great again. In 2017, after he became president, I went to Indianapolis to visit the Carrier plant. The factory, which had been slated to shut down in 2016, had been a campaign focal point for Trump's promise to bring good jobs back. When he won, he returned to Carrier to declare mission accomplished, telling the workers that he'd cut a deal to keep their plant open. But when I arrived, the Rexnord plant around the corner was closing. Those workers didn't get a visit from the president as their jobs disappeared, nor did the workers in Lordstown, Ohio, where the General Motors plant closed in March 2019. The workers I spoke to in Indiana and Ohio all wanted to keep the plants open, but none of them waxed lyrical about their jobs. They hadn't taken those positions to find fulfillment, they took them to find a paycheck. They took them for the weekends they'd have off, the homes they'd be able to buy. When I asked what they'd miss about their jobs, none of them said the work itself. They spoke of co-workers so close they'd become like family, of after-shift beers at the bar across the street, and of the solidarity that came from being active in their union, solidarity that brought them to the picket lines in GM's 2019 strike even after the plant had been closed for months. But mostly, they spoke of money, of the reality that losing a $1.26 an hour job, plus overtime, meant a serious downgrade in their standard of living. Page 14.